www.sitecquiz.com, sitecquiz, all one word, and a copy of the presentation is on the website together with all of the materials that I'll be referencing today as we get going and I introduce Robert McCullough. It's just after noon, and we'd like to complete this speaking engagement and discussion by 1 o'clock. Everybody's got...
Association. I wish to apologize, I couldn't make it there, so I am on the phone. So in response to claims made by the BC government on the forecast cost of the Site C power, you know, the unit energy cost, and the claim by the government of the cost of delay to this project, we have asked both Robert McCullough and Robert Botterill to research those claims. And well, as you're going to hear today, quite frankly, you know, the results are astounding. And you know, they simply reinforce the findings of the Joint Review Panel on the Site C project, that these critical financial questions have to be reviewed by the BCUC and experts. Like hearings such as that would have likely called into, you know, on experts such as Robert McCullough. So this is also basically the basis of our legal challenge, that, you know, we're seeking for due process to be done in a fair and transparent manner. So anyway, as a result of these findings, we have called on the Premier to do a number of things, and foremost is that Site C has to be delayed for a minimum of 2 years to allow for these, you know, critical issues to be reviewed and to save the ratepayers money, as you're going to hear today. So there's lots to cover here. So, you know, I wish to thank Robert McCullough for you know, making the trip up to Vancouver to present his work, and I'll pass this over now to Robert Botterill to start the proceedings.
Comments. First, I'd like to welcome everybody and talk a bit about the format of the meeting, and also to just touch on the materials that everybody has available either online or in their information kits. So the format will be that I'll make some brief opening remarks, and then introduce Robert McCullough, and then Robert will make his presentation. I'd ask you to hold your questions till the end, and then we'll open it up for questions, and we'll finish the formal proceedings at 1 o'clock. And certainly, if you have any other questions, you know, we'll be here after 1. In the kit of materials, what you'll find is a letter to the Premier dated today, requesting that the Premier delay summer 2015 start of construction for at least 2 years, and for a whole number of reasons. First, our analysis demonstrates that BC ratepayers would be saved $200 million by a delay of that sort, and delay to decide whether or not Site C really should proceed. And so that's $200 million of savings that would be achieved by delay. As you'll see in the kit, we're also looking for the Premier to fully respect the Site C related court case process is now underway, and the best way to do that is to suspend or delay any start to construction. We also would like to seek the review by the Auditor General of the financial basis for this decision. We find the findings of Robert McCullough very disturbing, and we think that the best way to get to the bottom of this, or one of the best ways to get to the bottom of this, is to ask the Auditor General to get involved, and we've done so today. We also need that 2 years to address the very disturbing findings of respected energy economist Robert McCullough regarding the Site C business case. And we need to see that done through an open, expert, and independent review of the Site C business case with full procedural safeguards. So that is the request of the PVLA, of the Premier. I just went into a bit more detail in terms of what the President of PVLA, Ken, mentioned moments ago. We also want to address some other fundamental flaws in the decision-making process and in the information that is being provided to the public on this project. I don't propose to go into this in any detail today, but in your kit you will see a letter from a respected securities firm in Toronto making it abundantly clear that large hydro is not green and does not qualify for green credits, and this is due to the large reservoir and dam that damage the environment. So in our view, it is completely misleading, if not untrue, to be arguing or stating to bond dealers and investment bankers in Eastern Canada and the US that this is a clean project, green project. And I don't distinguish between clean and green. It's not a green project, and you'll see in the letter that small hydro is, and there's definitions of small hydro from an investment banker's point of view. We also include some information about geothermal, because that was another big gap in the decision-making process. The PVLA takes no position on what the preferred alternative is to Site C, but we do take a position that there should be full and complete information on all the alternatives, and it's become abundantly clear that the information on geothermal is lacking. Last but not least, we were advised by BC Hydro in the form of an affidavit that a one-year delay in Site C would cost ratepayers $175 million. And in your kit, you'll see a letter where I provided advice to the PVLA. Excuse me, could you put your information on mute, Eagle Bay, whatever? Now, in terms of the savings, and I think this is absolutely critical, in the early years of Site C, the Joint Review Panel concluded that there would be losses because Site C is not needed as quickly as this government wishes to build it, which means that the Joint Review Panel's conclusion was there could be as much as $800 million in export losses from power we don't need. And that's very important, because when BC Hydro presented its affidavit saying there would be $175 million in cost to delaying a year, what they neglected to consider was the export losses. They also departed from their standard procedure in all other instances of actually calculating the impact on a present value basis. And from a financial perspective, if you've got costs and revenues and savings and costs over time, you need to take a present value approach. And so in the letter that you can read at your leisure, you'll find that we've concluded, based on BC Hydro's own information, that the losses are not losses at all. That in fact this government could delay or suspend Site C to allow these serious issues you're about to hear dealt with, and actually save the ratepayers money. I won't go into the fact that the last expert and independent review, which was the Joint Review Panel, expressed numerous concerns about Site C that they believe needed further review. And I particularly, on page 4 of my letter, there's a list. The one that I think is particularly germane is the panel cannot be confident that the IPP alternatives versus BC Hydro alternatives or supply versus demand management alternatives are accurately valued. So what we have is we have the expert and independent joint review panel raising the alarm bells in a number of areas. And what we have on December 16th is Minister Bennett saying, what I'd like to say to start with is that what has driven me as the Energy Minister over this last year and a half is what's best for the ratepayer of British Columbia, how we can acquire the power that we need at the least possible cost, and the answer turned out to be the Site C project. Well, today you're going to hear from a well-respected energy expert that simply is not true, and that we need to get to the bottom of this. And so what I'd like to do now is briefly introduce Robert McCullough, and then obviously turn the floor over to Robert. What I want to say is that in your information kit at the back and online is Robert's 20-page CV. And so rather than taking up valuable time with the CV, let me simply say it speaks for itself, and there will be a quiz afterwards to see if you've read it. And so without, as they say, further ado, please join me in welcoming Robert McCullough.
Thank you. I was a speaker at the Energy Information Administration's annual meeting a year or two ago, and they had gone through the very boring part of summarizing a 20-page vita. And when I got up, I said, all of that's true, but I'm the only person in the room whose grandfather was investigated for the Teapot Dome scandal, where the Republicans tried to steal all the oil. So I have qualifications that go back generations. Unfortunately, they're rather embarrassing. Thank you. Good morning, bonjour. It's a pleasure to be here. I have worked in Canada for 30 years. At the end of this, at least one journalist will say, why is it that some idiot from the U.S. had to come to Canada? That's a good question. We are often very foolish people in the U.S. It is not the case that we are that different, however. We are the closest in the world in culture and beliefs and philosophies in government, but most of all in economics. We have a fully integrated economic system. Even more integrated than our general economics is our energy. So it is not unusual for me to work in Canada. In the last 30 years I've worked in British Columbia, Alberta, in Manitoba, in Ontario, in Quebec, and Nova Scotia. You notice I skipped Saskatoon. I won't make any comments on Saskatoon, but that was not by mistake. So the issue today really is simply economics. And I'm not making any comments about the long-term resource plan. That was not my mandate. It was simply to do the homework. Years ago when I was a young man, the chief regulatory lawyer of Civcor, a huge, very successful utility in the U.S., said, never argue about the arguments, diddle the assumptions. And that was pretty good advice. He did that very well. The fact is, in any cost-benefit study, you start at the foundations of the structure. And that's the one issue in this debate that really has not been discussed nearly enough. I was just looking at William Nordhaus's book, and as you all know, he is a very famous economist. He spends a full chapter on the discount rate issue. We've spent one paragraph, and I'll go into that in some detail. We know that no speech cannot start without humor. I often quote Alice in Wonderland. The four branches of arithmetic are ambition, distraction, uglification, and derision. That, sadly, in public policy is an apt discussion. So I'm actually doing the derision part of this today and criticizing things. But I can also master reeling and writhing on occasion, so I'm waiting for your questions. On tipping the balance, we've had an enormous number of pages in this study, and literally, I stopped counting at 5,000 in the IRP. But the fundamental issue in any cost-benefit study, the actual pivotal question, starts with the discount rate. Following that are a variety of other pivotal assumptions. Because the discount rate can make such a difference, it needs to be excessively transparent. It needs to be argued thoroughly. One of the discoveries we came across here was that the Bonneville Power Administration, BC Hydro's Siamese twin to the south, had
Participant exiting.
That was the Bonneville Power Administration. Issued a study stating that they had based their discount rate on analysis in part from BC Hydro. And so one of the counterpoints I'm going to go through here is why Bonneville is using 12% for big hydro and BC Hydro is using 5%. That's a huge difference. That difference alone would make a resource decision entirely 180 degrees different. So, we are doing the assumptions today. First thing is the changing landscape. No one in North America has not heard that we're in the midst of a massive shift in the economics of energy. I discovered the other day that my ancestral farm in Oklahoma is having horizontal drilling under it for oil right now. So next week I might be very rich or much poorer, I don't know yet. But the point of the matter is that oil prices have crashed. US and Canada are leading the world in fossil fuel developments. Natural gas prices are so low at the moment that the Globe and Mail had an article on whether or not the LNG terminals were even affordable, considering the change in natural gas prices. Just as a point of reference, the Northwest, this is British Columbia and the 4 Northwest states, have a very extensive over-the-counter market in electricity. Every morning I get a report on the bid asks for forward prices. This is the report from yesterday. And as you can see, you can buy electricity on peak all the way out to 2019 at the moment for $35. Off peak, which is a third of the time, it's as low in the 20s. Now this is in spite of the fact that we're having an enormous drought. This is the worst possible year for these numbers to be this low. Why they are low is because our technology has dominated this. We have an enormous amount of renewables, and natural gas is at all-time low prices, and we have just changed this landscape. Against that is the UEC, which is British Columbia Hydro for levelized real cost. Every utility has a right to call that a different name, but what it really means is it is your common sense benchmark of what a resource price will be over the years. Now you'll notice nobody in their right mind would build anything today. Let me just go back to underscore that. If you can buy the next 4 years of energy at between $30 and $35, you're not rushing forward to pay anywhere up to $100. And so we've not reviewed the analysis behind this delay calculation, but frankly, it doesn't make very good sense. If I was going to recommend someone to something, which was to buy all the cheap stuff first, and then decide what to do 4 years from now. And frankly, at the moment, all you have to do is pick up the phone to get these prices. This is an open outcry market. Those are low prices. They're amazingly low prices. In fact, historically, they're among the lowest we've ever seen. So discount rates. As most of us know, at an early age, we fell in love and moved in with someone who is beautiful, compassionate, but most of all, prudent. And we've come home and we've said the really cute red sports car is very good. And of course, I'll buy it over time and it will be a bargain. And at that point, our wife or husband says, you have the wrong discount rate. And that question of figuring out the benefits over time is central to this. There's an enormous debate on any major project what it should be. It should be in the open. There are reasons why it should be low, but there are reasons why specific investment should be high. The discount rate for buying a lottery ticket, enormous. discount rate for buying a home for you and your children to live in is probably lower. Every economic analysis has to make that choice. In our case, it's one paragraph, and they did have an outside consulting firm review it, and that was another paragraph. So we have 2 paragraphs out of those thousands of pages to address this question. That's not the right number of paragraphs. Now, this question is not unique to BC Hydro. I've worked on issues pertaining to this at the Bonneville Power Administration, at the Tennessee Valley Authority, at Hydro-Quebec, and in Nova Scotia with a group of different utilities. Generally, big hydro is regarded as having more risk than the average investment. Not because it's intrinsically a bad thing. I'm not talking about environmentalism here. I'm simply talking about the fact that it is a large down payment in an environment with rapid change. It's committing a huge amount of society's funds, and we aren't exactly sure what will happen next. What we do know is that natural gas was 3 times as high as as late as 2008. This is a lot of change. Oil was twice as high a year ago. So there is enough change in that society to have a reason to worry about making one-time billion-dollar level investments. BPA, interested in this, put out a study, a very detailed study. It was backed by a survey of their peers, of which BC Hydro was one. And they concluded that 12% was a better rate. And I've just quoted the paragraphs from this, noting 2 things. One of their references is BC Hydro, and that their 12% was reasonable in light of the benchmarking study. They do not say, we called our peer, BC Hydro, our next door neighbor, the utility we are closest to in all ways. We got a completely different answer, and therefore we simply disagree. What they are saying is they called each of these, and they got very comparable answers. U.S. law in terms of discovering federal documents is very strong. We have filed a Freedom of Information Act seeking the benchmarking study. But there's an implication here that 12% is not only a good number, but also a number that to some degree had a buy-off from BC Hydro. So it's very worthwhile to get to the bottom of that. And again, there's nothing per se wrong with 5%. There are investments where you would agree 5% is an excellent discount rate. But there are reasons why 12% might be a better rate for mega dams. And we see across the industry that 12% is used. And I have personal knowledge of that because I've been investing in negotiations with a number of these groups. And I actually have seen 12% with my own eyes. Now, if you took 12% throughout the lot of them, you discover that you're tipping the balance enormously. These are the UEC numbers I showed you a moment ago. And they're able when you start, not at the end, which should have been had in detail 3 years ago. The natural gas revolution has gone in 2 ways, one of which is the fuel is very cheap. The second is the efficiency, the cost per megawatt hour has declined dramatically. We are just better at making natural gas equipment. Nothing very amazing about it. It's just a lot of scientists and engineers did their job, and we are much better at it than we were years ago. It also means that our upfront costs for natural gas have become very low. So frankly, they're almost the same anywhere in the world. You call Alstom or GE or Westinghouse or any number of other fine firms. You order the equipment, it shows up on the back of a rail car, and it's installed very close to load. It's not difficult. By contrast, a major hydroelectric facility is a massive upfront cost. So here's the discount rate. Should you pay all of that money up front, or should you in fact take an alternative where the stream of cost is spread out over many years? The discount rate determines which horse wins that race. At 12%, low upfront cost resources are much superior economically to high upfront resources. Again, I'm not talking about global warming. I'm not talking about anything more than the common sense of that computation. In any prudent calculation, a paragraph is not sufficient. That needs a chapter or many chapters. And it pertains to how you evaluate the risk of a multi-billion-dollar investment over something that's vastly less of a commitment of our resources for years to come. So when you ask somebody why this is, part of it is a lifetime. BC Hydro is estimating a 70-year history on this project. That's probably not even old enough. It maybe will have much longer. Most of our big dams are currently over 50 years old. The major dams on the Columbia are in their 60s. We certainly expect them to last many, many years to come. The only cost you usually have on hydro that's large is replacement of the turbines. That's the moving parts. That's underway on the Columbia now. Basically, a well-maintained hydroelectric facility is like my grandfather's hammer. When the handle broke, he replaced it. When the steel top broke, he replaced that, but it's still my grandfather's hammer. The Bonneville Dam outside of the Dalles will in fact still be there in 50 years. It'll still be the Bonneville Dam even if we've replaced bits and pieces over the years. But it is a commitment to a technology that lasts all that time. Average age of an industrial facility in the US is 17 years. So we're talking about 70, we're talking about a long time in terms of our rate of technological change. I've talked about massive upfront costs. My environmental friends talk about deforestation and climate change issues. I will leave that to them. They're experts on it, I'm not, but those are concerns that are raised in those debates. So the other question is, what happens when you eliminate the 200 basis point penalty for non-Site C resources? Now, in reviewing that, what we discovered was that people had risk-adjusted rates. The same report at Bonneville has a high rate for large hydro investments, but a lower rate for transmission. At Hydro-Quebec, wind has a lower discount rate than a hydro. Okay, anyone can argue about it. Everyone should argue about it. But I couldn't find another example where non-hydro projects were more risky than hydro projects. Now, I can certainly think of one, perhaps an oil-based 1940s technology plant plunked in load center. That would be very risky. But most of our new technologies aren't anything like that. And so when we're comparing windmills to hydro, it's hard to understand why a windmill would be more risky. So we did that calculation, and again, it accentuated the difference between the high-cost Site C and the low-cost alternatives. And again, this is not magic. A 200 basis point penalty is a penalty, but there's no logic to it. The utility I grew up in, where I was an executive when I was a boy, was recently having an IRP. Everyone does, all source bid, and they chose to build their own resources. Not because of any complicated calculation, it's just their cost of capital was that good. They didn't have to go outside and ask for someone else's cost of capital because they had a solid balance sheet, and they were just the best choice. By the way, that was a fully transparent decision. Everyone got to see the numbers. Everything was very straightforward. So next, where do we get the numbers in the UEC? Now, for those of you who have read this, there's a 500-page appendix to the 2013 IRP called the ROBAT. I'm not sure I can remember why it's called the ROBAT, but as we know, everyone is allowed to have their own acronym, and they liked ROBAT. So, I'm not sure I approve of ROBAT because I can't remember what it stands for. However, it has hundreds of different alternatives. Each alternative is broken out. The derivation of the UEC from the ROBAT data is not delineated. Other people have commented on the fact that, surprisingly enough, they did not include their assumptions and their calculations. It's easy enough to reverse engineer them to within 5 or 10%. It's not that they're outstandingly crazy, but it does require a little hard work. When we looked through them, we immediately noticed that some of them looked out of line. Now, there are any number of industry references for resource costs, and you can choose. There are many of them in Canada, in Europe, in the US. The US Energy Information Administration is well respected. It's transparent, you can see every number, you can go argue about it. They do not have a dog in this race. So we simply reached out and chose theirs for comparison. And we were surprised to find that a number of the values in the RODAT seemed out of line. Case in point, the cost of gas resources looked 30 to 40% higher. The efficiency of gas resources appeared to be off by 10 to 20%. Now that's even more surprising because you can literally go on the web to GE, Westinghouse, or any of the other manufacturers and look up the specs. This is engineering data. There's no debate about it. If they promise you a 6,300 heat rate and they don't deliver, you sue them. It's, you don't have a philosophic debate about that. The EIA is more sanguine. They do not report the best numbers they hear. They report what they think are the right numbers. And furthermore, we were very surprised about wind. Now, wind, as you know, is strictly an assembly line operation. Literally, anyone in this room can pick up the phone and order a wind turbine. And after a while, a very large semi will show up in your front yard with a several 100-foot wind turbine, and engineers will come and set it up, and you will be hated by your neighbors for life. But the fact is, that was an aside, sorry. The fact is that there is not that much deviation between wind equipment costs. There is a deviation between wind site benefits. So we should not see a dramatic difference in wind equipment costs between the ROBAT.
It's RODAT.
RODAT. Yes. You can tell this is not my favorite acronym. And industry practice. And we were surprised to find that there was an enormous difference. Now, I went back and then I checked, well, where are these wind turbines being sited in their study? We all know that if they're sited on Hudson Bay or in Alaska, they're going to be more, simply because there's no road there. However, Site C is in the Peace Valley where there is a road, and these are Peace Valley resources. So if the cost differential is the long day it takes to drive a semi to the Peace Valley, that makes no sense at all. So we did that calculation. And as you can see, using the EIA standard data, the differential becomes even greater. Now I want to specify that we have done nothing complicated here. This is application of industry available data. Even the 12%, the most pivotal assumption, is directly out of industry reports from peers of BC Hydro. So when we get to the bottom line, what we discover is that we're having an enormous differential between the cheapest and the most expensive. Factor of 2 to 3. So what's next? Fuel costs. Now, I'd like to be the first person to admit that I did not predict the change in technology in 2008 that revolutionized the natural gas industry. In fact, I may have been the last person to have predicted that. Almost every forecaster missed it. It was simply good engineering. There was no warning, there were no subsidies, there were no press releases. So I will not pretend that I have suddenly become a guru of natural gas forecasting, but I am in fact willing to say perhaps we should go check what the forward price is Now, we have a very liquid natural gas market in both Alberta and Louisiana. And literally, again, you can pick up the phone and buy all the natural gas you want from those markets. And I just actually checked the NYMEX. That's the Chicago Board of Trade, which is the largest exchange in the world. And the thick blue line is the natural gas price. The line that we're using in the IRP is the significantly higher dashed line above it. Now, I would like to stress,
Mike Carter.
I think that was Alberta leaving too. So I would like to stress that there is nothing wrong. This seems like a pretty good idea to me. Again, this makes an enormous difference, obviously, in natural gas. So now we're suddenly talking about a 3-to-1 differential in price between a 500 megawatt combined cycle unit and Site C. Now, someone is going to say, oh my God, Mr. McCullough, now that they're drilling in your family farm, have you become the shill for the natural gas industry? I know it sounds like that. I'm not. This just happened to be the resource that fell to the bottom, the most inexpensive of the resource stack, and that's the one I'm focusing on. But the same issues apply on issues like cogeneration and wind, simply to a lesser level. What we have here is a set of assumptions that, in effect, change the result. I used the thumb on the scale metaphor. And to a degree, using the wrong discount rate is a thumb on the scale issue. Some of the others, simply their studies are old enough that they need to be fixed. Certainly, 3 years in terms of some of these technologies, especially wind, is an enormous amount of time. Our ability to produce efficient wind has gone up unimaginably. And even in my own experience, we're looking at a 30% differential on the wind farms along the Columbia River. There's nothing more magic about it. It's the same wind. It's just we've gotten better at making those turbines.
Participant exiting.
That was the wind industry. Okay, I've killed that joke. I won't do it again. Okay, bottom line. Discount rates appear to be arbitrary and inconsistent with other sources, and conceivably inconsistent with BC Hydro's own sources. And I think we should actually see what BC Hydro had responded to the Bonneville survey. If they do have 2 sets of numbers, that should be out in the open and that should be defended. The resource data, the RODAT, did I get it right this time? You know, I saw a Japanese movie about RODATs, and they were bad. So the RODAT data simply needs to be refreshed. It might have been right 3 years ago, 4 years ago. It's not correct now. And the fuel costs, they're changing everything. The fact of the matter is we're in the midst of an energy revolution. Some of us are happy about it, others of us are not. But we can't just ignore it. It's out there, it's affecting our economy every day. So, I hope I have not been the most boring speaker you have ever met. Luckily in energy, it's very difficult to be the most boring speaker. Thank you. Colin Speakers? Yeah. Sir, can you identify yourself? Because if you turn out to be someone really important, I want to be able to suck up.
I'm Dan Potts. I'm retired. Been active in the energy industry for a number of years. It's interesting, of course, to rank various sources of electric power by their cost per megawatt hour, discounted, however you want to do it. But I guess one of the things it doesn't consider is the value of the electric power that they produce. And some of those sources of electric power have considerably more value than others. They're dispatchable, controllable. Others come and go at the whim of the resource itself. Don't you need to go a little further in that evaluation in order to come to some conclusion?
Absolutely, and we know that there's both an energy and capacity component, a dispatchability component, a storage component. I reviewed the 2013 IRP It did not look like that was done with the amount of clarity and research I would have liked. They didn't use industry standard models. Last year we did a review of the economics of the nuclear plant at Hanford, Washington. And we modeled the entire West Coast for 40 years using Monte Carlo. We did 25,000 games. That was for one study, and we didn't see that detail. I'm not going to pretend this is a resource plan. This is purely a critique on assumptions. But once you change that, then you have to go back through and do the job right.
Nelson Bennett with Business in Vancouver. We talked earlier about assumptions, and the report seems to assume that natural gas, thermal power, is an option, and it's not.
I can't hear you guys
unless
very
we
well.
scrap the Clean Energy Act. So I'm wondering how that changes. I mean, I don't know if the provincial government is prepared to change the Clean Energy Act, but if they don't, how does that change this report's findings? Would you still find that things like wind and geothermal are still more cost competitive than Site C?
I knew that my addiction to natural gas would come out pretty quickly. I actually would have preferred if wind had taken out that red bar, because I would have been able to dodge that question. Fact is, the voters of British Columbia should make their own choice on environment. That's not my job. My only job was using standard industry data to give them a sense of what the costs are. Natural gas as a base load is not my choice. When we did the 40-year study, what we ended up with was renewables, primarily wind, backed by natural gas simple cycle turbines for capacity. That tends to be cost effective, and it tends to reduce the emissions. So would I immediately rush off and propose a 500 megawatt combined cycle unit for downtown Vancouver? No, I think I would not if I was the planner. Would I eliminate all fossil fuels? No, I would keep some around where they were necessary, and the sheer efficiency of a peaker is enormous. They're cheap, they're reliable, and they're dispatched very rarely, because when you have wind and solar and hydro, you use something else. But again, I'm not putting myself forward today as the resource planner for British Columbia. That's pretty much up to you guys. Sir.
John Pullman from CBC Radio. What impact does the discount rate have on the overall cost of the Site C project?
Well, none, in the sense that we're talking about how we evaluate the options. I'm not talking about the cost of capital per se. I'm talking about the risk-adjusted cost for certain options. An enormous amount, because it directs us to the best possible choice. So this is more a tool that gives you the right answer on how to proceed once you do that resource plan that you wisely point out we have to do. So if you have the right discount rates, you get the right answer, and when you get the right answer, you'll probably get the lowest cost. And I realize that's a fuzzy answer because it's a fuzzy subject. The fact is, get the numbers right on the way in, get the analysis out and transparent, fight about every dit and jot, and then you'll get the lowest possible cost and hopefully the lowest possible emissions. Sir?
One other question. You've talked about the discount rate and how, in your view, the wrong discount rate has been used. I have a little bit of difficulty understanding just precisely what the discount rate is supposed to represent. Is it the cost of capital, in which case the province's borrowing cost represents the discount rate? If that's not it, what is it and how do you describe it?
Well, I addressed that in the report, but the answer is the basis is always the weighted average cost of capital. That's the general number you use. But different investments have very different risk-adjusted discount rates. So in the Bonneville Power Administration, in their capital analysis, proposed 12. They said, we believe there should be a risk adjustment for the following reasons. And I went through those. In our personal lives, there are very different discount rates for different issues. The discount rate for buying the really fast car is high. Discount rate for buying bonds is low. And we're used to risk adjusted decisions. Because big hydro is so big, these utilities have assigned a risk-adjusted rate that's quite a bit higher. It's an issue you're welcome to argue about. The major key is it should be argued about.
Now, but if you have a concept and you understand what that concept is, then you have a basis on which to argue whether or not various approaches meet that concept. And I don't understand what your concept of a discount rate is.
The base risk-free discount rate should be the cost of capital. There's a standard under Canadian law that sets it out at either 7 or 10%, if I can remember the number right. And you can go argue that it's part of Canadian law. But specific investments have different risks, and people make a risk adjustment to the overall cost of capital. And I've taught cost benefit, so apparently I didn't teach it very well because the students were not quite as feisty as you are. Sir.
Yeah, I had a question about if you compare projects that were behind the meter. So we're seeing, I'm in the solar space, and we're seeing residential rooftop in California eating the market, creating, essentially taking load from the utility at the high rate, creating almost a death spiral for the utilities. If you looked at a behind-the-meter solution, where do you think that might sit in here, and how does that sort of technological change influence how you would look at large hydro?
And this
Bunch
is
questions.
no, but this is directly on point with the question of technological change and why big dollar investments are scary to utilities. For those of you who've been following solar, the cost of a solar installation has plummeted. It didn't used to be cost effective anywhere outside of the hottest and warmest and sunniest regions. We now have people who are arguing their way all the way up the I-5 corridor that even with our memorably good weather and our frequent sunshine, that it's becoming cost effective this far up. This is science at its purest. We get better and better the more of these things we make. We're making a ton of them, and we're getting much better. And there's nothing in this that would represent current technology. This is just a question that it needs to be refreshed. Fact is, I'm in a debate at the moment in Oregon about whether or not it is cost effective to put a utility scale project in a park in Oregon, where the weather is terrible. And that gives you an idea of the rapid rate of that technological change. So, yeah, I agree entirely. I'm not a solar expert per se, but I will tell you, nobody in the industry who's following it is not impressed by the rate of change.
Robert, just before we go to the next couple of questions, we're sort of closing in on the last 10 minutes here. And a couple of things that I'd like, wondered if you could just touch on briefly. One is whether there's any magic in terms of discount rate analysis, in terms of who builds the renewable energy, so whether it's independent power producers or whether it's the utility itself. Does that impact how one assesses costs and benefits of a project? And then before we wrap up, I'm wondering if you can just recap your final conclusions in the report.
I knew I was having too much fun.
Can you take one more question? Is that possible?
Rob?
Yeah, but I'd like Robert to address those before we wrap up. So if you want to go ahead, that's great.
Ma'am?
That's fine.
Sir?
I'm Harold Steves. I'm a director of Metro Vancouver and on the Utilities Committee, which meets on Thursday. Last week, Metro Vancouver unanimously rejected the proposal to close the Burrard thermal plant. I'm not sure if you're aware of it. It's a plant, modern, updated, produces enough power for 700,000 homes, almost double what the Site C dam will handle. And I'm just wondering if you've looked at the Burrard thermal or could give us some idea of a plant that's already operating. I think it's paid their discount fee and is producing using natural gas compared to the Site C dam.
Well, there's no question at all that we have enormous growth in natural gas generation in North America. Hydro-Quebec just this month announced that they were restarting their Bécancour 500 megawatt unit, primarily for capacity, because that's a good use for natural gas. And no one in Quebec is less interested in the environment than people in British Columbia. Fact is, at these prices, there are some very good trade-offs. And so you see perfectly efficient, well-run natural gas baseload units all across the U.S. The fact is, they're cheap, and they're replacing other options that are more expensive and have environmental consequences that are greater. I'm not going to put myself forward as a expert on your issue, but I will tell you problems that it would have a role in this. That's exactly the decision that Hydro-Quebec just made.
Mr. Steve, should you go check that the carbon tax on that will be $25 a megawatt hour because of its gross inefficiency?
Yeah, I just want to address something. We're not here today to come up with the magic bullet in terms of a solution, but the whole purpose of this presentation was really just to highlight Robert's report and the impact that discount rate has fundamentally in altering the attractiveness of particular alternatives. So I appreciate that everybody has different views on what the magic bullet is, but I think what Robert's saying, I won't put words in Robert's mouth, but I think he's saying, geez, we got to do a lot more homework here.
That is exactly what I'm saying. And just to offset the natural gas issue, the wind issue and solar on the West Coast are dramatically the largest. Now, I've been given a hint from my employer and mandate that I should summarize, so let me do that, and I'll be certainly here as long as you'd like. Bottom line is, the base of this inverted pyramid is a series of very poorly documented assumptions. The assumptions have a critical impact on the outcome. They change the ordering of the underlying resources dramatically. If we use industry standard assumptions on the discount rate, Site C rapidly becomes one of the more expensive of the options, not one of the cheap ones. As we change assumptions concerning the 200 basis point penalty, we take away some of the disadvantages for alternative technologies. When we use industry standard numbers from standard industry sources, we get a very dramatic increase in some of the renewables like wind. And finally, it's been a long time since we did our fossil fuels forecast, and that should be considered as well. And in the end, the person who noted, well, British Columbia has certain choices on the environment. Absolutely. Everyone should make those choices. They should be out in the open. They should dominate the decision. I'm not proposing that I be put in charge of resource planning in British Columbia. I really am not the right person. But I'm not a bad person to go check these assumptions, and the assumptions desperately need someone to kick those tires. They're out of date. Some of them do not seem to be consistent, and all of them need a better job.
Great, thanks very much. I'm just, in the time we have left, is there one or two questions from those on the conference call line? Anybody want to pipe in with a question? I'll just turn up the volume a bit here.
Yeah, could you briefly comment on some of the accounting assumptions and changes that BC Hydro introduced into their comparisons late in the process?
Well, again, yes. As anyone who's ever been a utility executive knows, the cost of resources is the first step in the calculation. Every utility does a cost of service analysis. After that, you do a rate design analysis. The rate design is entirely different. The first is, how much money are you really going to spend? The second is, who are you going to charge for it? One of the interesting things about McLaren's presentation was he noted that they had suddenly saved 30% of the project of Site C by changing the rate design in British Columbia. That did not affect the cost at all. Not a single girder, not a single ton of cement, not a single turbine moved in this. This entirely was a decision by them to charge a different group of people. When you delay increasing rates, you're in effect raising taxes. At one point they said, well, we won't charge the water rental. Well, that simply takes some of the money that BC Hydro would have paid to the general fund of the province away. The province is spending the same amount, so someone's taxes have to go up or some program has to be cut. So that 30% really was not just a difference of apples and oranges, but really was a pomegranate. And so it is not an appropriate comparison. To the degree that we're working on this, we're talking about the costs, and that is real life invoices paid by BC Hydro to build the project. Later on, it's perfectly appropriate for people to debate how the rate design should be taken and who should pay for it. Should it be taxpayers, should it be ratepayers, etc. I haven't addressed that other than to say that Mr. McLaren's comments are a bit confusing.
Great, thanks. Is there one last question from out in the world coming in by conference, or we'll just move to Ken Boone to provide some wrap-up comments? Okay, we've got time. One last question from the audience here in Vancouver.
Sir.
We've heard the justification politically for Site C change several times. To start off, they used a number, it could power 450,000 homes. We become net exporter in power the last couple of years. The justification then we heard was about powering this much vaunted LNG industry. So taking electricity from our power grid to power the cooling process, enormous energy demands of these LNG plants. We've also heard at the JRP, executives from BC Hydro comment on freeing up excess power to export to California. Doesn't make a lot of sense looking at that chart of the mid-sea export prices. They were talking about $100 down to turning gold into lead, I think is how Mr. Potts over here described it. So if you could just comment on that idea, and you've talked a lot about natural gas and sort of comparing it as a resource to, but here we're talking about actually taking hydroelectric power potentially to compress natural gas as a part of an export strategy here. Can you comment on that that statement or that justification for Site C that's being made by this government?
Well, the LNG issue generally has been described as one where we're saving the Chinese and the Indians from themselves by moving our LNG to Asia. And that's one of those dubious arguments that you really have to puzzle through for a while. We're not constraining the activities of the Chinese or the Indians. We're giving them a market alternative. It's conceivable we'll change some of their decisions. It's conceivable that we won't. It seems unlikely to me that we are going to find an export market by accelerating resource development from Site C, and that's the other issue. So because our prices are so low. And they're low not only because of natural gas, but they're low because we've gotten so good at making wind turbines. In 2012, the off-peak price on the mid-sea market was negative 1/6 of the time. Now, that's hard to wrap your head around. But what it meant was we were producing so much energy in the center market that we could not find the transportation to move it out to users. We had to pay people to turn off their power plants. This is not an export market that I would be hankering after. And we now have the governor of California who would like to expand their renewable sector dramatically. He's talking about going to a much larger share for renewables. And as you can see, the real life prices during a drought are not that high. And that simply reflects how efficient that market's become. Sir.
Yeah, Eric Anderson here. You've spent quite a bit of time on the supply side, and I'm just wondering if you'd take a few minutes to talk about the demand side.
Well, I can tell you one quick story on the demand side. We have a client in Texas, in Dallas, who has a convention center. And as you know, convention centers are by definition huge. Texas convention centers are double huge. And combination of need and egoism makes them really big indeed. And their chief engineer took me to their central convention room, which literally is acres in size. And he looked up at the ceiling and he said, you know, I just pulled out all of the resistance lighting, and every light in this room is an LED, and that saved half a megawatt in one room. So that's a lot. And you're thinking that rate of technological change. Capacity changes across North America have fallen dramatically with technology. And we're just getting better and better at that as well. I have a client in Kalama, Washington that recovers steel forming by something almost like a hybrid car. Once they're through with one process, they recover some of the energy that took. Basically, they're making car hoods, etc., and refrigerators. So our rate of change of energy intensity has fallen dramatically, and our rate of growth in loads has fallen dramatically as well. The situation in New England, New York, and the Midwest in the U.S. is they're showing relatively little load growth. Not because we aren't leaving the recession, we are, but simply because our technology is changing so rapidly. So the other side of it's pretty exciting.
Great. Okay, I'm going to have to stop it there, and I'd like you to all join me in thanking Robert McCullough for his a few wrap-up comments to make, and one question. I always think it's great when there's questions and answers, and lots of questions and answers like this in a session like this, because very often what happens is you go to these sorts of events, particularly I may say sometimes when ministers are holding the technical briefings, and the questions are always orchestrated, and the answers are orchestrated, and you know, you see the communications folks nervous. I really appreciate the probing questions this afternoon, which leads me to one question, and I'm going to read very briefly and then put that question to Robert McCullough. In the conclusion of Robert's report, he says, in summary, adopting realistic changes from standard and well-respected sources makes an enormous difference. Using BC Hydro's assumptions, the difference in cost between the least expensive option and Site C is minimized. Using industry standard assumptions, Site C is more than 3 times as costly as the least expensive option. In fact, Site C fares poorly when compared to cogeneration, wind, landfill, and coal gasification. While the cost and choice of options deserve further analysis, the simple conclusion is that Site C is more expensive, dramatically so, than the renewable natural gas portfolios elsewhere in the US and Canada. Our analysis indicates that the Site C portfolio may well be twice as costly as the renewable natural gas portfolio adopted elsewhere. So of course my question is, do you stand by your findings having been grilled?
It was pretty friendly grilling, I've got to tell you. No, absolutely. The fact is there are 100 integrated resource plans available on the web. You can go take a look at them. They're from all over the continent. And what you're seeing is most people like wind and solar. It is increasingly efficient technology. They're worried about the capacity consequences. What do you do on a cloudy day with no wind? Therefore, you have backup natural gas generation. And that's been the package that's been selected most frequently. You may not approve of it. I mean, there are many reasons not to, but the dollars are pretty clear.
Thanks very much. Anyway, I'd like to ask Ken Boone if he'd like to make some final comments. Ken?
Yes, thanks Rob for that, and thanks to Robert McCullough for doing this briefing on his review. You know, and I think like our takeaway, I believe, from what we are hearing is, you know, in a sense, I would say if Site C goes ahead, if this government continues to push Site C ahead, you know, we are all screwed in several ways here. You know, so I don't see how the government can do anything but put a hold on this project and allow this to be reviewed properly and review their own process, have the Auditor General do a proper review of how this financial investment decision or final investment decision was made, because you know, something's not right. And you know, it's frustrating for us, you know, the Peace Valley Landowners Association. Why are we the ones needing to do the due diligence that the government should be doing? You know, the government has to be doing this right. It's the most expensive public infrastructure project ever in this province. It's possibly the most expensive one in Canada right now. And look at what we're hearing now. So I don't think there's any option but the government to put the brakes on this and get it right. So now, having said that, on a lighter note, you know, before we let Robert get away, we have a lady up in the Peace River country who's been building mugs, coffee mugs, and we've been selling them as fundraisers, you know, to do our fundraising. And so we'd like to present Robert McCullough with the $8.8 billion coffee mug. But don't worry, Robert, we're not going to charge you anything for the mug. It's a gift.
If you could see me, I'm taking a sip of my coffee out of my $8 billion mug.
It just